Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Virtual Southern Home and Garden Show virtual presentations. Today we have Mr. Lucas Holman talking about woody ornamentals. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Pulaski Lions Club, Bankston Motorhomes, Big Creek Winery, Blue Line Pressure Washing Services, Bull on the Run, Farm Bureau, Five Stones Landscaping, Giles County Co-op, Haney Realty and Property Management, Pulaski Electric Company, Pilot Maintenance, Tri-Green Equipment, the Giles County Chamber, and UT-TSU Extension, Giles County. We also ask that you be sure to check out our vendors, who are All-American Gutter Protection, Aspen Hill Growers, Butcher Drafting, Columbia Kubota, Flowers Creamery, Georgia's Quilts, Guardian Garage Floors, Kathy G Creations, Lane Roofing, and Leaf Guard. Be sure to check out our website, thesouthernhomeandgardenshow.com. Also find us on Facebook at Pulaski Lions Club Southern Lawn Garden and Home Show. We are also on Twitter and Instagram. We hope to see you soon.
Darby, can you see my screen now?
I can.
Okay, good. Well, we're going to jump right into this. And if you've got questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll catch them at the very end. Darby asked me to talk about my favorite topic of all time, which is woody ornamentals, mostly because I'm a plant nerd. So we're going to kind of jump in. I'm a plant nerd through and through. My great-great-great-grandfather planted this tree in Warren County when his first wife died in the late 1800s. The tree is still there. That's me and my mother below the magnolia tree that my great-great-great-grandfather planted. Some of these trees, they're meant to last a lifetime. And my relatives who are all buried underneath this tree have been fertilizing this tree for a number of years now. But we're going to talk about things, and I'm going to try to talk about what plants ideally we should be growing in Tennessee. We go to the garden center, we go to the nursery, and we see a list of all kinds of things blooming, and they'll be the first week of April. So if I go to any local garden center nursery right now, I'm going to see things blooming their hearts out. And if you go to our landscapes, there's going to be nothing really blooming its heart out yet. Why? A lot of these plants that we see, they ship them in from the south. They're not really acclimated to the cold yet. Then we get a freeze or some frost damage, and some of them will get bit back. But we see plants also sold in nurseries that ideally should not be planted in Tennessee. Some of them do better than others. So the one on the right is a camellia, and it never did well in Tennessee. I think the name of it was called Setsugeka. And the one on the left is just a hybrid tea rose. We see them, they look beautiful. They were treated with some, like on the rose, they were treated for black spot. So they have a beautiful foliage. They would love to sell them to you. So make sure you do your research before you take them home. So what is the simple definition of a woody ornamental? A woody ornamental develops some type of a woody stem that may or may not come back from that stem. In some woody ornamentals, we always think of trees and shrubs, but we don't think about some perennials that at the base of the stem, it turns woody by the end of summer. So this is an example of a woody ornamental. This is salvia, black and blue. We have a lot of species of salvia that develop some type of a woody stem at the base, and we would classify them as woody ornamentals also. So in Tennessee, it's really difficult to say this one plant will do well the entire state. Why? We are so diverse. If you go all the way to East Tennessee, we're almost zone 5 when we're touching Virginia. And then if you go all the way to the west part of the state in Memphis, we're almost zone 8. That is a wide range of temperatures. So keep that in mind. So sometimes when you see a plant recommendation for Tennessee, make sure you do your research where you are. I'm going to assume, since I know Darby, Kevin down there, we're pretty much in Middle Tennessee zone 7. Unless you're on the upper Cumberland, which is the Cumberland Plateau, then you're going to be in zone 6, which is about a 10-degree difference. So make sure you research plants that do well for you. If you got questions, make sure you contact your extension agents. we've got a lot of new publications coming out that are plant recommendations for Tennessee. And slowly they're coming down the pipeline. And I'm going to hit on these again. For the most part, Tennessee is zone 6 to 8. The average rainfall is about 52 inches. Now, 2019 is 64 inches. I haven't looked at 2020, but this year is on tap to probably beat 64 inches already, and we're only in April. We have issues with winter kills. So last month, no, 2 months ago, here in Lebanon, we had a week of ice and snow. Schools were shut down. The issue was we had some winter kills on things that we normally don't get winter kills on. Some newer plants called Distillium, which is an evergreen shrub that normally does halfway decent in Tennessee. All the tops were burnt black from the ice. Indian hawthorns. If we go a couple of days in single digits now, 2 months ago we hit 7 2 days in a row. And that really affected some of these evergreens that have done well, that have kind of skirted by on our hardiness zone for the past few years. We had a true zone 7 winter this year. I mentioned Indian hawthorn because we had a landscaper. This was probably 4 years ago. We had a week where we were hitting single digits every night. So the landscaper planted probably between 300 and 400 Indian hawthorn in one subdivision. All right. That spring, most of them, 90% of them were completely burned back to the ground. They were having to resucker up from the base. So he told me, he said, what happened? I said, this is just winter kill. He said, well, I bought these at a local nursery. I said, I know. I said, they would love to sell you some of these things, and they'll love to sell them to you again. But Indian hawthorn is only hardy pretty much to zone 7, and that's where we are. But 4 years ago, we had a zone 6 winter. And it really affected his business when you have 300 to 400 of the same species that's affected. So keep that in mind. If you put all of your eggs into one basket, that's when we're going to have a bad winter. We do have issues in Tennessee where we have microclimates. Next to a house, next to some concrete sidewalk, it could be next to some other trees or shrubs, spots that are just a few degrees warmer or cooler based upon their proximity. So some of those Indian hawthorn zone 7 looked all right because they were next to a brick house or next to a concrete structure, and that concrete kept just enough warmth to keep them. But any of them that were away from the concrete or the brick really were burnt all the way to the ground. So my only suggestion was to cut them all off at the ground and let them sucker up. And I'm assuming that he still lost a few. But we have some plants that just skirt the hardiness zones for Tennessee. Then in Tennessee, we have issues with ice. We had issues with this a few years ago, and it seems like every couple of years we have a good ice storm. What's great about ice is it does insulate, but the issue, like on the plant on the right, that's an Elysium called Florida Sunshine. It got so much ice on it that it split my plant in half. This was at an older house that I had, and it split my plant in half and killed it because the ice weighted down the branches. Even though that Elysium is hardy in Tennessee, the ice killed it. So when we see conifers in woody ornamentals, most of them prefer a cooler climate. And I put these two names up there really fast. So we have two conifers that is mostly used in Tennessee for some reason. People will buy them at Lowe's or Home Depot, and I'm not knocking them, but we'll see them for sale at the nurseries. And people will say, well, they just didn't survive the summer. So the first one, Colorado blue spruce. Where do you think is the best place to plant a Colorado blue spruce? Colorado. Alberta spruce. Where do you think is the best place to plant a spruce? Alberta spruce, Canada. So we don't have a lot of spruces that do well in Tennessee. They need to be in the mountains. They need to be in the cold. So the plant that I'm showing you in that picture there is called an Arizona cypress. What do you think they prefer? They prefer hot and they prefer dry. So we need to do some research on some of these plants. The first thing I want you to do is go to some of these UT gardens. Let them kill the plants first before you go take a gamble on something. So they've got all these lists of recommended plants for UT or for gardens in Tennessee. And the UT has an exclusive conifer collection also. So you can go to the gardens in Crossville, Knoxville, or Jackson and go see what looks really well for them, especially if it's a conifer. If it's growing well in Jackson, Tennessee, then you could probably grow it all over Tennessee. Jackson's a little bit warmer than we are here in Middle Tennessee. Do some smart shopping. Find factual information from the UT Gardens website, which they have all their research data there, or go to their UT Gardens Facebook page. And I'll show you some other pages here in just a second. One of my favorite ones from the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville. Local nurseries can be good or bad. Some local nurseries grow their own plants. Other local nurseries buy in 100% of what they're selling. So they're going to go to a nursery in southern Alabama, buy all their roses, camellias, and things, and bring them up here because they're really beautiful the week before Mother's Day, and then try to sell them that week. And then we plant them at home, and they don't survive the first year, and we wonder why. Do your research about your local nurseries. Please research your plants before you buy them. If you're really into books, this book right here, and I know it's humongous. The Manual of Woody Landscape Plants is hands down the best tree, shrub, woody ornamental book in the market. Now, it is not a cheap book. If you're an extension agent, this is a book you need to have on your shelf. It goes through every species of plant, every cultivar, tells you how big it is, tells you what diseases it has, and it also tells you what hiccups it may have had. Like, I had died the first 3 years I had in the ground. They'll plant 50 and they'll say, well, 20% of them died. Well, that's stuff we don't want to grow. When you also buy plants from the store, how many of you look for bugs and diseases? You look under the leaves, you look on the stems, you look on the bark. If it's small enough and manageable enough, you look at the roots. We may see some of these evergreens, some of these conifers in small pots in some of these nurseries, and they'll be in the sales section, and there'll be maybe a juniper, half brown, half green, and we think, I can save it. Take it out and look at the roots. Usually if it's half green, half brown, then root rot is already set in. What color should healthy roots be? Roots should be white. If the roots are black, mushy, smelly, it's not going to make it. Even though it may be 25 cents on the sale rack, it's best to leave it there for somebody else. Site selection. Watch for drainage, and I think the number one issue that we have with some of these trees and shrubs in Tennessee is planting them in the wrong spot, like boxwoods. Boxwoods are very intolerant of soggy soils. White pines are very intolerant of soggy soils. Japanese hollies are very intolerant of soggy soils. And if y'all are like Wilson County, you got clay. Clay holds water. The biggest issue is it's just putting plants in the wrong spot. So if you're developing a new bed in your landscape or something, you're like, I'm going to plant some stuff here. I'm going to make a giant bed in the middle of my lawn. I'm going to put trees, shrubs, flowers in. This is going to be my flower bed. Go out to the middle of it, dig a hole, fill it up with water, and see if that water drains away. If that water drains away within 24 hours, you can pretty much plant anything. If the water's still there within 48 hours, you may be a little bit more restricted on what you can grow. If that water is there after 72 hours, you have a list that's about this long of trees and shrubs that you can grow. Because think about roots. Roots are just like people. They got to have oxygen. If a root sits in water the entire time, it'll drown. It's kind of the same principle for people. If we go underwater too long, we're going to drown. Site selection. This is an arborvitae, probably green giant. And this was in downtown Gatlinburg. I think that's where this picture was taken. And they had humongous evergreens going down this little bitty row surrounded by concrete. And I'm eager to, I want to go back to figure out where this was to see what it looked like 3 or 4 years later, because there's probably not enough growing room for these poor arborvitaes to actually grow. Their roots are out under the concrete. No water's getting in under most of it. It's just the wrong spot for the wrong area. if this was green giant arborvitae, they're going to get a lot wider than the little 18 inches they gave them at the base of the ground. They're going to have to constantly keep them cut back. I think the biggest issue that I have with landscapers is they want to shape everything into a ball, and they want to cut. Ideally, if we plant the right plants in the right spot, we're not having to cut all the time. I'm a lazy gardener. I don't want to cut something all the time. Sun and shade. If you see this on your tags for your woody ornamentals, full sun is 6 or more hours of sun. Partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, and shade is less than 4. That's me with some camellias at a local private, and it was a private garden in Knoxville. And the garden was called Gatop, G-A-T-O-P, beautiful garden, but he had some very great camellias that do well in Tennessee. And I know I've harped on camellias. Some camellias do well. Others do not do well. There's a really small list of camellias that do well in Tennessee. Soil quality. Some plants are extremely particular about pH, such as blueberries and azaleas. Blueberries and azaleas need the pH to be 5. The number one issue of why blueberries fail in Tennessee is the pH was not low enough. And you're going to spend more money trying to amend the soil that's going to constantly revert back to whatever you had. Get a soil test. $15 will save you a lot of money and headache along the road. And it's awesome. It's pretty blunt. It'll say, May the 15th, add 2 pounds of 6-12-12 per 100 square feet. Whatever the case may be. That's just an example. And it'll tell you what to do each month. If your pH is off, it'll tell you how much sulfur to add or whatever. If your pH is too low, it'll tell you how much lime to add. Don't guess on this stuff. $15 will really save you a lot of money in the long run. This is my do not plant list of woody ornamentals. When I first got started, I kept a mental list of all the plants I got calls on. And number one, overall, hands down, was Leland cypress. Why? How do we see Leland cypress planted? We see 50 of them in a row as a screen to block out neighbors. And the number one issue with Leland cypress, they're not drought tolerant. So the issue here, this is from the Soil Pest Plant Center. That's Soil Pest Center. That's a typo on my part. I stole some of these pictures from their Facebook page. But this was drought stress. So evergreens will stay green a long time after they're starting to die. We had a drought 2 years ago in the fall time between August, September, October. We went 8 or 9 weeks without rain. Lelands were affected. A lot of conifers were affected. But it doesn't actually show drought stress until the springtime. So when are people calling? When they see issues. If you had some Lelands and we go more than a week or two without water, you need to probably water them. But at this point, this was 6 months after the fact that we went through a drought. There's nothing that you can do to save these. So what this does is it weakens them to get some other things. So I'm going to talk about these other ones as I go through it too. The other big issue on Leland cypress is a disease called Ceridium canker. And Ceridium canker comes in when the plant is stressed, when we go 9 weeks without water. So this fungus gets inside the plant, shuts off water flow to certain branches, and you'll start seeing random branch after random branch die. How do fungus spread? Through the air, through spores. If you have 50 Leland cypress in a row and one gets a fungus, Ceridium canker, what do you think happens to the other 49? Theoretically, it can go right down the entire line and wipe them all out. So I want to make sure you know, if you're planting a screen, mix it up, put some different species in there. That will really help out in the long run. Here is some more. The first sign of Ceridium canker is a dead branch. So you'll go back to where the branch meets some living material and you'll see a wound and you'll see sap pouring out. I have seen this quite a bit. But we go to the garden center and we see new cultivars of Leland cypress. This is a gold one called Gold Rider, and we think, oh, that's got to be awesome. No, it's still susceptible to all of the other issues that we talked about. Laurels, they will always have holes in their leaves because of a disease called shot hole. So what happens is we've got water on a leaf, a spore is flying around, lands on that water droplet, and the plant sheds it itself, and it drops off. There's really not a whole lot you can do for it. It's just ugly. The other big issue with laurels is they're in the peach family. Have you ever tried to successfully grow peaches in Tennessee? It is not easy because of a couple of issues: brown rot, moth, curculio, codling moth. But the other one is the peach tree borer. Laurels are in the peach family. They are also susceptible to the peach borer, and that's more than likely what happened here. Our city government called and said our laurels are dying. And what they'll do is they'll get in the base of a stem here, and they'll drill a hole, lay their eggs, and that whole branch will die. And if that branch sits there long enough, those eggs will hatch out and go affect the other one. So if you see a laurel with a branch dying, go ahead and cut it out and throw it on the burn pile. Pin oaks, they're succumbing to a disease called bacterial leaf scorch. It's a bacterium called Xylella, and it shuts off water flow. It looks just like drought stress. What happens is all the edges of the leaves turn brown, and it looks like they're scorched. The disease is called bacterial leaf scorch. Also, the bottom branches die. So when we're seeing this, there's nothing you can do. It's already in the system of the plant. So the first one, Ceridium canker on Leland cypress, it's in the plant. There's nothing you can spray to do to save it. Pin oak with this bacterial leaf scorch, nothing you can do to save it. It's in the plant. And I'm sorry, but the issue with these two is they're spread by bugs. So this was a homeowner in Mount Juliet. He had probably 20 pin oaks on both sides of his driveway, and just about every other one was already dead. And the other ones were starting to show signs of bacterial leaf scorch. And you hate to be that person to say, there's absolutely nothing you can do to save these pin oaks, because they get mad at you. But he's welcome to get a second opinion. Roses have a lot of hiccups. Now, I still plant roses because I enjoy roses. I've got a few in my landscape, and they're the real fussy ones. One's kind of a ground cover rose. I've got a couple of other ones. One of them actually died this year, and it was a hybrid tea. The biggest hiccup with roses, and you'll see it on knockouts, is rose rosette virus, spread by a mite that blows through the wind. How do we see roses planted? We'll see them in commercial buildings, and they'll have 50 in these large berms. Once one gets it, and you think, I'll just pull it out, put another rose in its spot, those mites are already on all the other ones. What happens is slowly, you'll start seeing twisted growth. All the flowers twist, and you'll see a whole inflush of new growth that's red, and that one stem will grow all kinds of leaves. It's a virus. There's nothing you can do for it. There was a few years ago a rose marketing itself as rose rosette resistant. That's a lie. So there are no roses right now that are rose rosette resistant. If you plant a rose, especially if you plant some of these knockouts, just do it sparingly and kind of know in the back of your head they may not last a long time. But the rose rosette virus doesn't just affect knockouts. This is on a wild rose. Also, it can affect hybrid teas, grandifloras, even these carpet roses, these drift roses that we see. It can affect anything that's in the rose family, or the rose genus, I guess, Rosa. Rose family also includes apples and things. Rose rosette virus doesn't affect apples. My last one on the do not plant list, or plant with caution, is a Bradford pear. A homeowner called here in Lebanon, said, I want you to come look at my Bradford pear. So they had just bought this house. I assumed that the Bradford pear had split And the previous homeowner, wrapped a chain and a come along around that baby and ratcheted that thing back together. Bradford pears have a lot of issues. They're invasive tendencies that are blooming all over the sides of the interstate still. But the biggest issue is they split. They all have an expiration date. So Bradford pears, ideally find something else. You can plant serviceberry. You can plant some of these crab apples. If you want something blooming white, you can get some of these neat magnolias that are coming out. Let's find something else other than Bradford pears. And that also includes Cleveland Select pears. They also have the same issue. But we need to be aware of new diseases that are also coming down the pipeline. It's not, I haven't seen this yet, but it's in Nashville. It's in Warren County. This is boxwood blight. If you ever have something weird affecting some of your shrubs, trees, contact your local extension agent. Some of these diseases we watch, and we have maps that we kind of monitor where they're at so that we know to start watching for it. But boxwood blight will leave black dots on the leaves and black stems. Eventually, the whole plant will die. Arborvitaes can be sensitive to winter damage, and that's what the homeowner called on this one. And he had all these arborvitaes, and every tip branch was dead. Really, nothing you can do for this. It'll just fall off naturally. There are some boring insects that will drill in, but the whole branch will die. Watch for newer pests that are coming out. And I wanted to show you this Facebook page, the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville, which is the UT Soil Lab, also the Pest Identification Lab. They post the most cool things on Facebook, but they also keep us up to date on what's out there that's coming down the pipeline. They've kept us up to date on crepe myrtle bark scale, spotter and lantern fly, which is not in Tennessee yet, emerald ash borer, which is making its way through Tennessee, stink bugs, and ambrosia beetle, flat-headed apple borer. They'll usually tell us like, hey, we saw some ambrosia beetles in Warren County 2 weeks ago or something like that. They try to keep us up to date on that. That first one I mentioned, and I thought I'll never see it because it's not been in Tennessee long. Boy, it did not take long for me to see it. This is crepe myrtle bark scale. It leaves white cottony patches on the crepe myrtles. And I had a homeowner call and said, my crepe myrtles are completely turning black. And the issue is they turn black because of all the feces that these little white bugs are dropping. So all that black sooty mold grows on feces of aphids, of scale, and things like that. So if you've got crepe myrtles and you see little white dots, you can use quite a few things. There's a lot of insecticides that are labeled for this now. But just watch out for your crepe myrtles. It's only been in Tennessee a few years, and it started out in Memphis, and it went to Knoxville within just 3 or 4 years. And I think it's just on transported material. We need to look at these crepe myrtles, anything that you buy, before you take it home and travel 2 or 3 counties over. Really, 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 really look at this stuff. A lot of this stuff spreads so easily. I mentioned a little bug called an ambrosia beetle. This was a newer planted maple, in a homeowner. And he had a beautiful maple, and it was probably 8 or 9 feet tall, and it had not been there long. And it wilted pretty much overnight. So he called me and he said, my maple died within just a couple of days. I want to see what it is. And I got there and all the leaves were wilted and down. And we looked everywhere on this for a wood boring insect. And I saw one tiny hole right here and a little piece of frass coming out, which is sawdust. And that's one of those boring insects had drilled in, girdled it from the inside, and killed this maple tree within just a couple of days. It's so hit and miss, but they typically go to trees that are stressed out. And this tree was buried too deep. It probably wasn't watered after it was transplanted and things like that. But we only saw one tiny little bitty hole. And the hole was about the size of a toothpick. And the little frass coming out was about 1/4 of an inch. It was small, but we eventually found it. And once a tree already has those in them, it's best to throw them on the burn pile too. I'm not trying to depress you, honestly. And I know what you think. Well, this guy's really depressing. I can't grow anything. Are all bugs bad though? No. If you have squash, you know you hate this guy. Squash bugs. But we see bugs like this and we think, oh, that guy's got to be bad. He's got spikes all over him. No, this is the Gulf fritillary. That's a little bitty neat butterfly feeding on passion flowers. So do your research. We don't want to broadly try to kill every bug on our property because we have a lot of good ones also mixed in with the bad. We see holes in trees sometimes and we think we've got a wood-boring insect. It's already a goner. If you see holes and they're horizontal, that's usually the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is a type of woodpecker. Normally, this doesn't kill trees. I get branches brought into my office once every couple of weeks with this on, with this on it. And they'll say, my tree's dying. This is killing my tree. Lichen itself does not kill anything. I've got lichen growing on old fence posts on my property right now. I've seen it on all kinds of things around my property that were already dead, that have nothing, old tires and things like that. Lichen itself can be a sign that your tree is stressed out from something else. So sometimes it'll come in really fast and we think that's what's killing my plant. Normally, it's something else that's actually killing the plant. We don't need to get caught with our plants down. Watch out for them. Look out for bugs and things like that. Walk through the garden every couple of weeks if you're a really hardcore gardener and look for bugs, look for holes and things. Also, watch for some of these woody ornamentals that are known to have problems. So these were the 5 problems in our Master Gardener manual that some trees and shrubs just have. Aggressiveness, root issues, litter problems, messy production, short-lived species. So aggressiveness, if you've ever planted a purple leaf plum, you know those things sucker up in your yard 30 years after you die. And they come up everywhere. Even if the tree is dead and gone, you're still going to have purple leaf plum suckers coming up. Sometimes we see them called sand cherries. Root issues, maples will always have roots near the surface. And if we put a bunch of mulch on top of that, that's going to raise those roots up even more. We see issues with willows planted near septic tank field lines. We see litter problems, sweet gum balls, those spiky balls. I have black walnut trees all around my house. In the fall time, when those things hit my roof, it sounds like a tornado is coming down my driveway. Messy production. If you have ever planted your car under a hackberry in the fall time, you get this sticky sap, and we think that hackberry's got sap. That is actually aphid's feces from the hackberry woolly aphid. So it's not sap, it's just bug poop. We also have some that are just short-lived, such as the ornamental cherries, the Bradford pears. Ornamental cherries, Yoshino, Kwanzaa, normally they don't live long. And I mean long, like 20 years. Some of these trees we'll see, like that magnolia that my great-great-great-granddaddy planted 120, 130 years ago. Magnolias are really fine. Ornamental cherries, you won't see a 30 or 40-year-old ornamental cherry. They are just not there. Keep in mind, we have to have male and female of some to actually get fruit. Hollies, if you're growing hollies and you want berries, you got to have a boy around. Typically, we'll talk about some of these deciduous hollies that are really taking off. You'll buy a red one, maybe, and you need to make sure you buy a boy with it. So you're going to go buy some deciduous hollies. The boys will have names such as Southern Gentleman, Jim Dandy. There's another one's got Shadows Male or something in the name. But if you buy a bunch of hollies and you want berries, make sure you buy at least a boy to throw in there too. If you're buying these small ones, it'll say China Girl or China Boy. Keep that in mind. A couple of the big ones are hollies and ginkgos. Typically, we don't want fruit on a ginkgo because it smells like animal feces. Know what you want before you get to the garden center. if your crepe myrtle is just listed as pink, it's probably best to leave it there because you don't know how tall that's going to get. Do you know how many pink varieties of crepe myrtles there are now? There are hundreds of varieties of pink crepe myrtles. It could be a dwarf one that only gets 8 or 9 feet tall. It could be one that gets 30 or 40 feet tall. Just keep in mind, look for a legitimate name on these things. Look at the roots before you buy. If you buy a huge ball and burlap tree or shrub, I know that's impossible. If it's something that's manageable, that you can see the roots, do that. Check the caliper. Every 1 inch of caliper means 1 inch of root ball. So if the caliper of the tree is 2.5 inches wide, the girth of the main stem, the root ball itself needs to be 2.5 feet wide. I'll stir the pot just a little bit. We see research on people amending the soil before they put a tree or shrub in. They'll buy a tree, and then the garden center will also sell them soil amendments, soil acidifiers, or maybe some kind of root helper or root tone. The best thing you can do is put the same soil back into the hole. So once you plant you get your hole dug, you get your tree in there, you start putting the same soil back in there, because what we'll do is we'll make a beautiful soil for this tree, and it won't actually branch its roots out into our native soil. Okay? We need to just throw the regular soil back in there and not quit amending the soil. Balled and burlap typically are dug when they're dormant. If you see a balled and burlap in August, kind of in the back of your mind, think theoretically this thing has been dug for 8 or 9 months and it could already be stressed out. Place in the hole, remove any strings and burlap from the top. We get calls and I'll go look at a tree or shrub that's dead. And one of our big local banks here had a row of maple trees planted. I'm not a huge fan of monoculture of the same species planted, 40 of them in a row. But the middle one died. And the bank called and said, we just want you to look at this maple. When you get to the base of it, they left the strap on, and it had basically choked it off after a couple of years. Just cut off that string off the base of it. So this was some pictures from the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville. These big maples had left all the landscapers had left all the string on, and it eventually wore it out to where a nice windstorm come through and broke it at the ground. Planting, like I said again, new research shows that amendments can create a bucket that traps water, improve soils from the top down, mulch, and also when you plant a tree or shrub, make sure you're scoring the roots, because if we go through on these circular pots, the roots will just keep growing around in a circle. Take your knife 2 or 3 times in there and cut it. If we were looking at these, the next couple of pictures are just proper ways to plant trees. You'll see at the base of the ground a root flare. So it kind of looks like a bell bottom. That bell bottom needs to be at the surface of the soil just barely. If that's covered up, and it looks like our tree is a telephone pole going straight into the ground, then our tree is buried too deeply. Now, did you make that mistake or did the nursery? It could be either one. Sometimes these trees in nurseries are buried too deep in the pots. Dig it out. Look for that root flare. It should be there. When we see on some of these trees and shrubs, if it's a huge tall tree, you may have to add stakes to it. And I'm going to show you some pictures of bad stakes here in a second. On the root ball also, make sure you peel back the top on a ball and burlap tree, and then you can just kind of put it in the base of the hole or cut it off. So I told you that picture of the tree. I told you about that tree at the bank. Had a row of maples. The middle one had died. Here's where they left the strap and all the string and all the plastic around the base of the tree. Staking is only if necessary. You can also get those wooden dowel rods from some craft store, sharpen the end, and you can nail those into the ground to hold the root, to basically nail the root ball into the ground, and then just cut it off at the ground. That way your mower can go over the top of it. I've also seen people put boards across the top of the soil that are eventually nailed into the ground with big spikes. So a homeowner was having some issues. Now, I can't remember what these trees were exactly, but they were staked so tight the tree couldn't move at all. So I just told her, I said, you got to cut all these stakes off, because when you eventually have to take them off, the tree's not going to be used to wind and it's just going to flip over. These trees were not tall enough to worry about staking. 5 or 6 feet tall, but she had those things staked crazy tight. A couple of do's and don'ts. I've just got a few slides left and then we'll wrap it up. Don't fertilize the first year. Ideally, sometimes we see people over fertilizing. We need to let some of these trees and shrubs kind of get established before we do that. Don't put plastic around the base of the plant. You're going to stop water, and then you think, I'm going to prevent weeds. All that mulch that's on top of the plastic, once it breaks down, it's going to make a great atmosphere for weeds to germinate. So the weeds will be on top of the mulch, on top of the plastic, and you've still got all this plastic below. The last 2 houses I've owned, it took me a while to rip out all the plastic that these people put out. Watch the water. Don't overwater them. That is probably the number one issue with shrubs or trees dying in the landscape. Some of them don't like to be wet. Ideally, if you have a timer and it's watering 3 or 4 times a week and they're in the ground, they've been in the ground for a couple of years, that's probably too much water. And don't weed eat them to death. That could be you or your landscaper or your husband or your wife's fault. If we go through and weed eat our tree all the way around and we take off all the bark, you're going to kill it. We're going to make a nice wound for bugs to come in. We're going to make a nice wound for fungus to come in. Ideally, we should not be hitting the base of the tree with anything, because the xylem and the phloem are right below the bark. They're not in the middle of the tree. They're right under the bark. If you take off all the bark, that tree will slowly dehydrate and die. Mulch, 3 inches works well, not touching the base of the tree. Don't make a mulch volcano. That root flare that I was talking about needs to be exposed. So if you pile mulch all the way on top of your tree, what does mulch do over time? It composts. So if you have a big pile of mulch on top of the base of the tree, you're composting your own tree that you just planted. We got to get away from that. It holds moisture, slowly breaks the tree down. All mulches are good. We'll get questions like, should I use pine? Should I use cedar? Should I use pine straw? It's whatever you want. It's your house. All mulches are well. I'm not a huge fan of this chopped up tire rubber mulch, because that's there for life. Pruning, research. Spring flowering stuff, you prune after they bloom because they form their flowers in the fall. Plants that bloom on new growth can be pruned after spring. So quinces, for example. Quinces form their buds in the fall and they bloom in the spring. If I go through and prune all of my quinces in the wintertime, I'm going to cut off all the blooms. We do have some that are tricky. Hydrangeas, you really have to know what kind of hydrangea you have to know when to prune it. All paniculatas, which are the big white ones, lime light, little lime, bloom on new wood. You can prune these back in late winter. The macrophyllus, which are the ones that are blue, purple, pink, red, normally they form their flower buds in the fall. So if I go through and I've got a big blue hydrangea and I go through every winter and cut off all those dead looking branches, I'm cutting off all the flowers. So on these hydrangeas here, these were paniculatas, the big white ones. They form their flowers on new growth. You can cut these back to 12 inches in late winter and they'll come back just fine. That hydrangea right there, that little pink one, that's the ones that bloom on old wood, but we have some that are reblooming now, so it really gets complicated. But ideally, those don't need to be pruned in the fall. Never prune anything in late fall. Why? This is a boxwood. A homeowner called, all my boxwoods are dying. So their landscaper went through in September, October, pruned all of their boxwoods into the shape of a box, because that's apparently what you're supposed to do. And then we had a warm day in November. The boxwood reflushed out new growth. All that new growth the next week got killed, and it was just burned. And he was mad, and I said, that's just your landscaper did it, or you did it yourself. Prune crepe myrtles appropriately. If you want a crepe myrtle that stays 10 feet tall, buy one that stays 10 feet tall. I hate to see these masses. They look like giant tumors. Normally, within a couple of years, you cut them so many times, those knotty areas at the top of those branches there will eventually not grow anything out because you've basically taken all the buds. Cutting back ruins the sculptural form. And just find a cultivar that you want. A lot of these newer purple leaf ones, they don't get anywhere near 6 or 10 feet tall. And I've had some of these planted near my house. I don't think they ever got 5 or 6 feet tall. They were really cool. Red ones, though, can be really tricky. That picture one there is dynamite. Dynamite is the easiest to find red crepe myrtle, but it's also the largest red crepe myrtle, 25 feet tall. If you want something shorter, go with Red Rocket. If you really want something shorter that stays less than 10 feet, go with Red Rooster. And I have seen all of these for sale at garden centers. You will sometimes have to go hunting for some of these. If you just go to the same garden center and expect them to have different things, that's probably not the case. You need to go hunting to other places also. Whew. This was a southern magnolia. The landscaper had pruned a homeowner's southern magnolia in July, and I'd pulled down her driveway because she had other questions about something, and my eyes just kept going back to that. And I said, ma'am, can I have a picture of that? She said, yeah, my landscaper just finished with that. And I said, okay. I have never seen a hack job as bad as this on a southern magnolia. I wish I could remember where it was so that I can go back and see if it's actually alive or not. Crepe murder again. Normally they need to be tall. No reason why this was in a big parking lot at a big box store that we needed to go through and prune all the tips of those branches. Landscaper was just trying to make money. That's like I've had family members get taken by these door-to-door people saying, you know, it's time to top your trees. We can top them for $3,000 right now. That way you'll save a lot of money. We're the cheapest people. And they get snookered. And the people thinking they got to top their trees. Don't do that. Don't do that. Screens. Avoid planting all of the same species in a row. Plant a mixed screen. We got to get away from planting 50 Leland cypress in a row. Throw in some southern magnolia, some red cedar, arbor vitae, holly, Arizona cypress, some of these junipers. Make it a mixed screen. Because if one of the middle ones die, which it probably will, it won't look funny, because if you had a row of 50 Leland cypress and the middle one dies, you're not going to find one to match the same size generally. Plant species are a major clue. So when people call and they're like, I've got some issues on some euonymus, I've got some issues on some Helleri holly, dogwoods, lilacs, azaleas, cherries. These were kind of the ones that just, you already know when someone calls what the problem is. Cherries are always going to get some kind of boring insect or fungal canker. Euonymus are going to have scale, powdery mildew. Helleri holly, Japanese hollies, boxwood, root rot. Azaleas, the big issue with azaleas is they do all right if they're not sitting in water and the pH is low enough. They need a low pH. Even though dogwood trees are native, how many dogwoods have y'all killed? My mother-in-law has planted quite a few, and they always die. Even though we say plant native, dogwoods are native. Boy, they die at the drop of a hat. Boring insects, fungus, anthracnose, poor site selection. Oh, lilac, powdery mildew, and other fungi. Conclusion, my last slide, Darby. Go to the UT pages. They always highlight plant of the month that you need to be looking for in your garden. Research resistant plants that may be resistant to some of these diseases and bugs that are coming through. Visit the UT Gardens in Jackson, in Knoxville, in Crossville. Go see what looks good in their gardens before you buy it and put it at your house. Also, just Google the UT Gardens plant of the month. It'll tell you what was a good plant to focus on for maybe even in January or February. You're wanting to garden still, they'll show you some things to kind of to do in those dead months of winter. All right, Darby, I am done. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, well, you have a couple of questions in the chat there, and one of them asks, can you share some camellias that grow well in 7A? Should Yuletide be covered in the winter? I have planted it on a brick wall.
Yuletide, I don't know about. Typically on the camellias, they were looking, UT grew a whole bunch out one year. And you can Google it. It was one guy who bred a bunch of really hardy camellias, and they were called Ackerman hybrids. His name was Ackerman. And you can Google the list and find the Ackerman hybrid camellias. And we also see some of the ones that do all right with April in the name. It'll be April Tryst, April Winter, and things like that. Normally they bloom in April in Tennessee, but those normally do well. I don't know exactly about Yuletide, whoever asked that question, so I'm sorry. There's so many camellias out there now. How about the rubber circle mats for mulch? Those would be fine as long as they're porous and water can actually get through them. I think the ones I'm thinking of, they look like plastic mulch, and I think water goes through them, Linda. But as long as it's keeping you from hitting the base of your tree with a weed eater or with a mower, that's great. Anybody else have any questions?
Looks like it's kind of a quiet group here, so.
I'm scared, y'all.
Great presentation, Lucas. Thank you very much for being with us today and presenting for our Southern Home and Garden Show virtual presentations.
Who's speaking next, Darby?
Deal is next.
Oh, is he on this same Zoom?
No, I think he's on the next one at 11.
11, I think.
Yes, at 11, and he's doing backyard wildlife.
Okay. Well, y'all have a good rest of the day.
Hey, Lucas, that's a good job. I was going to say, you mentioned Indian hawthorns. I had planted those, and they did really well for a few years. And then all of a sudden, it took that one cold snap, and they were just done.
Yeah.
And they were beautiful, and I loved them, but, you know, they just didn't work, you know. And what you said was exactly right.
You said hawthorn, right?
Yeah, Indian hawthorns.
Yeah, and I think in one of these Woody manuals, he even mentions can be sensitive. And we just had a really bad winter. I think it was 2017. Boy, it wiped out most of them. And I felt bad for that landscaper. The landscaper said, well, the nursery sold them to me. And I said, I'm sure they did.
Yeah, well, that was a recommendation from our guy down here. And he came out my house and told me what to put, and that was one thing. And they were beautiful. They had little old white blooms on them, you know, in the spring. And
I know the issue was the nursery he was buying them from were growing them indoors. They were growing them in cold frames. And he just said they grow them themselves, but they literally were growing them in cold frames to overwinter them. And I thought that's probably not a good sign.
Wow. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, that was a good job. A lot of good information there.
Yeah. Well, holler anytime if you or Darby have any questions that you don't know. Y'all can send me an email.
All right, we sure will. And I got Tina to order us 2 of them books that you had right there, so we'd have references here.
I'm looking at it right now, and this is the new edition.